In July 1943, across the rolling steppes of western Russia, the earth trembled under the weight of the largest concentration of armored might the world had ever witnessed. Here, near the ancient city of Kursk, two colossal war machines prepared to collide in what would become the most devastating tank battle in human history. Over 6,000 tanks, 2 million soldiers, and 4,000 aircraft converged on a single battlefield where the fate of nations would be decided by steel, fire, and the courage of men pushed beyond their limits. This was not merely another battle in the grinding war between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. This was the moment when Hitler gambled everything on one final throw of the dice, believing that victory here would restore German prestige and crush Soviet resistance once and for all. Operation Citadel, as the Germans code-named their assault, would either shatter the Red Army or mark the beginning of Germany's inevitable defeat. The stage was set in a landscape that seemed almost peaceful in the weeks before the storm. The Kursk Salient, a massive bulge in the Soviet lines stretching over 120 miles from north to south, jutted deep into German-held territory like a dagger pointed at the heart of the Reich. To German commanders, this salient represented both a threat and an opportunity. Soviet forces here could launch devastating attacks into Ukraine, but if the Germans could encircle and destroy them, they would eliminate 5 entire Soviet armies in a single stroke. For months, both sides had been preparing for this confrontation with the methodical precision of master chess players positioning their pieces for a decisive gambit. The Germans assembled their finest divisions, their newest tanks, and their most experienced commanders. 70% of their armor on the entire eastern front rolled toward Kursk, spearheaded by the fearsome new Tiger and Panther tanks that represented the pinnacle of German engineering. The Tiger tank was a monster of steel and firepower, weighing 56 tons and armed with a deadly 88mm cannon that could destroy any Soviet tank at ranges where return fire was impossible. The Tiger seemed invincible. Its massive armor could shrug off most enemy shells, while its precision optics allowed German crews to deliver knockout blows with surgical accuracy. Yet this technological marvel came with a price. The Tiger was so heavy that most bridges could not support it, forcing crews to ford rivers up to 15 feet deep, a process requiring 30 minutes of preparation that left them vulnerable. Even more advanced was the Panther tank, technically classified as medium armor but weighing nearly 45 tons. With better gun penetration than the Tiger, superior speed, and enhanced cross-country mobility, the Panther should have been Germany's ultimate weapon. Instead, it became a source of frustration and disaster. Rushed into combat before its mechanical problems were resolved, Panthers broke down in alarming numbers. Of the 184 operational Panthers that began the battle, only 40 remained functional within 2 days. While German engineers perfected their steel beasts, Soviet commanders prepared the most elaborate defensive system ever constructed. Marshal Georgy Zhukov, the architect of victory at Moscow and Stalingrad, convinced Stalin that this time they would not retreat. Instead, they would transform the Kursk salient into a killing ground where German armor would be methodically destroyed. The defensive preparations stretched 300 kilometers deep, layer upon layer of minefields, anti-tank strongpoints, artillery zones, and fortified positions that would channel the German assault into carefully prepared traps. The Soviet tank force at Kursk was massive, but diverse in capability. The backbone remained the T-34, a tank that had revolutionized armored warfare with its combination of sloped armor, reliable diesel engine, and potent 76mm gun. Though individually outmatched by the newest German tanks, the T-34 possessed advantages that statistics could not measure. Its simple, robust design meant it could be produced in vast numbers and maintained by crews with minimal training. More importantly, it performed superbly in the mud and snow that bogged down heavier German machines. Yet the Red Army's tank force included troubling weaknesses. Over a third of Soviet tanks at Kursk were light T-60 and T-70 models, barely more than armored cars when facing German heavy armor. Even the mighty T-34 struggled against the up-armored Panzer IV tanks, while the frontal armor of Tigers and Panthers remained essentially impenetrable to standard Soviet weapons. Only the massive Su 152 self-propelled guns, nicknamed beast killers by their crews, possessed the raw firepower to destroy German heavy tanks at short range. The human element proved as crucial as the machines themselves. German tank crews were veterans of 3 years of warfare, their skills honed in the deserts of Africa and the vast expanses of Russia. They understood their equipment intimately and had developed tactics that maximized the advantages of superior German optics and armor. Many had served together for months or years, developing the instinctive coordination that separated elite units from mere collections of individual fighters. Soviet tank crews, by contrast, represented the full spectrum of experience and training. Elite Guards units contained veterans who had survived the desperate battles of 1941 and 1942, men who had learned to fight with cunning and courage against seemingly impossible odds. Yet many crews were recent conscripts, hastily trained on equipment they barely understood, thrown into battle because the Soviet Union's survival demanded every available man and machine. The air above the battlefield promised to be equally contested. The Luftwaffe concentrated over 2,000 aircraft for the offensive, including their newest fighters and ground attack planes. German pilots, though fewer in number than earlier in the war, remained among the world's most skilled aviators. They faced a Soviet air force that had been rebuilt from near destruction, equipped with improved aircraft and pilots who had learned hard lessons in earlier campaigns. As June turned to July, the tension became almost unbearable. German reconnaissance flights photographed Soviet positions daily, while Red Army spotters tracked the steady buildup of enemy forces. Both sides knew the battle was imminent, yet neither could predict exactly when or where the storm would break. Soviet commanders received intelligence about German intentions, allowing them to position their reserves and adjust their defensive plans. German commanders, confident in their technological superiority, believed they could overwhelm Soviet defenses through sheer firepower and tactical skill. The final German force assembled for Operation Citadel represented the Wehrmacht's last great offensive capability on the Eastern Front. 50 divisions, totaling nearly 900,000 troops prepared to advance behind 2,700 tanks and assault guns. This concentration represented not just military might, but the hopes and fears of a nation that had committed everything to total war. Success would vindicate Hitler's strategy and restore German momentum. Failure would leave the Reich defensively positioned against an increasingly powerful enemy. Across the lines, Soviet defenders waited in positions that had been months in preparation. Nearly 2 million soldiers, 5,000 tanks, and 31,000 artillery pieces stood ready to meet the German assault. Behind them stretched the industrial might of a nation that had learned to convert its entire economy to war production. Soviet factories were producing 4,000 tanks per month, a rate that dwarfed German output and ensured that losses could be rapidly replaced. The stage was set for a collision that would determine the future of Europe. In the pre-dawn darkness of July 5th, German artillery began the bombardment that would signal the beginning of the largest tank battle in history. The thunder of German guns shattered the pre-dawn silence, sending fountains of earth and fire erupting across Soviet positions. For 90 minutes, the most concentrated artillery barrage on the Eastern Front since the opening of Barbarossa hammered the forward trenches. The ground shook as if the earth itself was convulsing, while smoke and dust rose in towering columns that blotted out the rising Sunday. This was the moment both armies had anticipated and dreaded, the opening chord of a symphony of destruction that would reshape the war. As the barrage lifted, the first waves of German armor emerged from their assembly areas like steel leviathans awakening from slumber. Panzer divisions that had carved their names into the history of modern warfare rolled forward in tight formations, their commanders confident that superior technology and tactical skill would once again prove decisive. The 4th Panzer Army struck from the south, while Army Detachment Kempf attacked from the southeast, their movements coordinated with the precision of a master clockmaker. From the north, the 9th Army under General Walter Model launched its own assault, though Model himself harbored deep reservations about the entire operation. Unlike his southern counterparts, Model had studied Soviet defensive preparations with growing unease. His intelligence officers reported defensive positions of unprecedented depth and complexity, protected by minefields so dense that clearing them would require days under constant fire. The initial German advance met resistance that exceeded every prediction. Soviet defenders, dug into positions they had spent months perfecting, absorbed the assault with stubborn determination. Anti-tank guns, carefully concealed and expertly sighted, opened fire at ranges where German tanks expected easy passage. The crack of high-velocity cannons echoed across the battlefield as armor-piercing shells sought their targets with lethal precision. Yet it was the minefields that proved most devastating to German momentum. Engineers had calculated that clearing paths through Soviet defenses would take hours, not days. Instead, they encountered mine densities that approached 1,000 devices per kilometer of front. Tanks advanced at walking pace, while sappers crawled forward under machine gun fire, probing for explosives with bayonets and bare hands. Every meter gained cost precious time and irreplaceable lives. The Tiger tanks that were supposed to spearhead the breakthrough found themselves struggling against an enemy that refused to cooperate with German tactical doctrine. Soviet anti-tank teams, armed with new weapons and hardened by years of combat, targeted the massive tanks with suicidal courage. They knew that even the mighty Tiger had vulnerabilities, weak points where skilled gunners could achieve penetrating hits. Track wheels, vision ports, and engine compartments became priority targets for defenders who understood that stopping even one Tiger could disrupt an entire attack formation. Meanwhile, the vaunted Panther tanks that represented Germany's technological future began breaking down in alarming numbers. Transmission failures, engine fires, and steering problems plagued units that were supposed to demonstrate German engineering supremacy. Crews watched helplessly as their advanced machines became immobile targets. Abandoned on battlefields they were meant to dominate. Within hours of the opening assault, Panther companies reported combat effectiveness dropping to dangerous levels. The Soviet response revealed a level of tactical sophistication that surprised German commanders. Rather than simply absorbing punishment in static positions, Red Army units conducted calculated withdrawals that drew attackers into prepared killing zones. Artillery batteries, pre-registered on every approach route, unleashed devastating barrages timed to catch German formations at their most vulnerable moments. The Katyusha rocket launchers, nicknamed Stalin's organs by German troops, added their distinctive shriek to the growing crescendo of destruction. Soviet tank units, positioned in carefully chosen defensive positions, waited for German armor to close to effective range before opening fire. The T-34 crews had learned bitter lessons about engaging Tigers and Panthers at long distance. Now they fought from prepared positions that maximized their advantages in close-range combat. Ambush tactics, developed through years of desperate fighting, allowed lighter Soviet tanks to engage German heavyweights on more equal terms. The fighting grew increasingly vicious as German spearheads penetrated deeper into Soviet defensive zones. Villages that had seemed insignificant on planning maps became crucial objectives, their capture requiring hours of house-to-house combat. Soviet infantry, fighting with the desperation of men defending their homeland, contested every building, every street, every basement. German assault troops, accustomed to rapid advances and quick victories, found themselves grinding forward at enormous cost in time and casualties. By the end of the first day, German commanders realized that Operation Citadel was not unfolding according to plan. Advances measured in kilometers rather than the dozens of miles anticipated by higher headquarters. Tank losses, particularly among the irreplaceable Tigers and Panthers, exceeded acceptable rates. Most troubling of all, Soviet resistance showed no signs of weakening despite the punishment being inflicted. The battle's intensity escalated on the second day as both sides committed additional reserves. German commanders, recognizing that breakthrough required maximum effort, ordered their best formations forward regardless of cost. The elite Waffen-SS divisions, including the feared Leibstandarte and Das Reich, prepared for assaults that would either achieve decisive victory or exhaust Germany's offensive capability entirely. Soviet defenders, reinforced by fresh units moved up during the night, prepared to meet these renewed attacks with equal determination. The defensive system that Zhukov had designed was proving its worth, channeling German attacks into predetermined zones where concentrated firepower could achieve maximum effect. Every hour that passed without German breakthrough strengthened Soviet confidence and weakened German morale. The air battle above the ground combat added another dimension to the carnage. Luftwaffe squadrons, flying multiple sorties per day, attempted to provide close support for advancing panzer columns. They faced Soviet pilots who had learned to fight with skill and courage that matched their German opponents. The skies above Kursk became a three-dimensional battlefield where aircraft fell like burning meteors, their destruction adding to the apocalyptic atmosphere below. As the battle entered its critical phase, both sides understood that everything now depended on will, endurance, and the ability to absorb punishment while continuing to fight. The largest tank battle in history was reaching its climactic moment, where the fate of nations would be decided by the courage of ordinary men operating extraordinary machines in conditions that tested the limits of human endurance. The defining moment of the entire battle approached as German commanders threw their most elite formations into what they hoped would be the decisive breakthrough. On July 12th, near the small village of Prokhorovka, the largest single tank engagement in human history was about to unfold. Here, in a landscape of rolling hills and scattered farms, 1,500 tanks would collide in a maelstrom of steel and fire that would determine whether Operation Citadel succeeded or failed. The German 2nd SS Panzer Corps, spearheaded by three of the Wehrmacht's most feared divisions, rolled forward with grim determination. These were not ordinary soldiers, but the elite of the elite, men who had carved their reputation through years of victorious campaigns. Their Tiger tanks, though fewer in number than Soviet propaganda would later claim, represented the pinnacle of German armored technology. Each crew had trained for months on their massive machines, learning to exploit every advantage their superior armor and firepower provided. Facing them across the undulating terrain came the Soviet 5th Guards Tank Army, a formation rebuilt from the ashes of earlier defeats and now commanded by officers who had learned the harsh lessons of modern warfare. These crews understood that their T-34 tanks were individually outmatched by German heavyweights, but they possessed advantages that went beyond mere statistics. They knew this ground intimately, had studied every fold in the terrain, every depression that could provide cover, every rise that could serve as a firing position. As dawn broke on July 12th, the temperature was already climbing toward what would become a scorching summer day. Inside their steel coffins, tank crews sweated in the stifling heat as engines roared to life and tracks began to churn the dusty earth. The air filled with the acrid smell of diesel exhaust and cordite, as both armies prepared for what everyone sensed would be the battle's climactic moment. The German attack began with methodical precision. Tiger and Panzer tanks advancing in wedge formations, designed to concentrate maximum firepower at breakthrough points. Their commanders had studied Soviet defensive tactics and believed they understood how to counter them. What they had not anticipated was the ferocity and tactical sophistication of the Soviet response. Soviet tank commanders, rather than waiting passively for the German assault, launched their own attack directly into the advancing enemy formations. This was not the desperate charge of inexperienced crews, but a calculated gamble by officers who understood that close-range combat would neutralize German advantages in armor and optics. If they could force the battle into a point-blank slugfest, Soviet numerical superiority might prove decisive. The two armored masses collided with an impact that could be heard for miles. Tank guns boomed with deafening frequency as crews fired as rapidly as their loaders could handle ammunition. The narrow valley became a cauldron of destruction where visibility dropped to mere yards through clouds of dust and smoke. Tanks maneuvered desperately to avoid enemy fire while seeking favorable positions for their own guns. The chaos was indescribable. Crews found themselves engaging targets at ranges so close that ricochets from their own shells endangered nearby friendly vehicles. Tank commanders, trying to direct their drivers through the melee, shouted orders that were lost in the thunderous cacophony of battle. Men fought with the desperate intensity of those who understood that survival depended on killing their enemies before being killed themselves. German Tiger crews, accustomed to engaging Soviet armor at comfortable distances, suddenly found themselves surrounded by T-34 tanks firing from multiple directions. The Tiger's thick armor still provided protection, but their slow traverse rates and limited visibility became serious disadvantages in the swirling close-quarters combat. Soviet crews, exploiting their superior mobility, darted between German positions like wolves attacking a wounded bear. The psychological impact proved as devastating as the physical destruction. Tank crews on both sides, trained to fight as part of coordinated units, found themselves isolated in a battle where communication became impossible and mutual support broke down. Individual tank commanders made split-second decisions that determined not only their own survival, but the fate of the broader engagement. As the morning wore on, the battlefield became littered with burning wrecks and disabled vehicles. Tanks that had dominated earlier engagements lay twisted and smoking, their crews either dead or fleeing on foot across the contested ground. The mechanical breakdown rate soared as engines overheated, transmissions failed, and tracks snapped under the strain of continuous high-speed maneuvering. Soviet T-34 crews demonstrated remarkable tactical flexibility, using their tanks' agility to exploit every weakness in German formations. When direct frontal attacks proved futile against Tiger armor, they maneuvered to strike at side and rear armor where penetration was possible. Teams of T-34 seconds coordinated their attacks, with some tanks drawing German attention while others moved to flanking positions. The German response revealed both the strengths and limitations of their tactical doctrine. Individual Tiger and Panzer crews fought with skill and determination, their superior training evident in every engagement. Yet their doctrine emphasized methodical, coordinated advances that became impossible to maintain in the chaotic close-quarters battle. German commanders found their carefully planned formations dissolving into individual duels between tank crews. By midday, the temperature inside the tanks had become nearly unbearable. Crews fought in conditions that tested the limits of human endurance, their vision blurred by sweat, their hearing damaged by the constant firing of main guns in enclosed spaces. Men collapsed from heat exhaustion while their comrades continued fighting, loading shells and operating equipment with hands that shook from fatigue and terror. The tide of battle shifted moment by moment as first one side, then the other, gained temporary advantages. German Tigers would clear a section of ground, only to find themselves outflanked by fresh Soviet reserves moving up from concealed positions. Soviet advances would penetrate German lines, only to be met by devastating counterattacks from panzer formations that had reorganized in nearby villages. The air-above-the-ground battle became equally contested as aircraft from both sides attempted to influence the outcome. German Stukas dove through intense anti-aircraft fire to attack Soviet tank concentrations, while Soviet Sturmovix strafed German armor with cannon and rockets. The sky filled with the trails of burning aircraft as pilots pushed their machines beyond normal limits in support of their comrades below. As afternoon approached, both sides began to show signs of exhaustion. Tank units that had begun the day at full strength were reduced to scattered survivors fighting individual actions across the churned battlefield. Ammunition supplies ran low as crews burned through shells at rates no planner had anticipated. Fuel shortages forced some tanks to halt in exposed positions where they became easy targets for enemy fire. The human cost mounted with each passing hour. Tank crews who survived the destruction of their vehicles found themselves fighting as infantry across ground that offered little cover from enemy fire. Medical personnel risked their lives to evacuate wounded men from burning tanks, often under direct fire from enemies who showed no mercy for non-combatants. Yet neither side showed any willingness to break off the engagement. Too much depended on the outcome of this single battle for either commander to accept anything less than total victory. German officers, knowing that failure here would end any hope of strategic success for Operation Citadel, urged their men forward despite mounting casualties. Soviet commanders, equally aware that defeat might open the road to Moscow, committed their last reserves to hold the line. The battle raged on as shadows began to lengthen across the contested ground, both armies locked in a death struggle that would determine the future course of the war. As evening approached, the battlefield at Prokhorovka had become a graveyard of twisted steel and shattered dreams. The ground, once covered with summer grass, was now churned into a hellish mixture of mud, oil, and blood. Hundreds of tanks lay scattered across the terrain like the bones of prehistoric beasts, some still smoldering, others eerily silent in the gathering dusk. The acrid smoke that rose from burning fuel and ammunition created an otherworldly atmosphere where visibility remained limited, even as the sun began its descent toward the western horizon. The survivors on both sides moved through this apocalyptic landscape like ghosts haunting their own destruction. Tank crews who had escaped their destroyed vehicles stumbled across the battlefield, some helping wounded comrades, others simply trying to comprehend the magnitude of what they had witnessed. Many were in shock, their faces blackened with smoke and grime, their eyes holding the 1,000-yard stare of men who had looked into the abyss and somehow survived. German commanders, surveying the carnage from their command posts, began to grasp the true cost of their gamble. The 2nd SS Panzer Corps, once the pride of the Wehrmacht, had been bled white in the furnace of Prokhorovka. Of the nearly 300 tanks that had entered the battle that morning, fewer than half remained operational. More critically, the irreplaceable Tiger tanks that had been Germany's technological ace were now scattered as burning wrecks across the Soviet countryside. The Panther tanks, supposed harbingers of German technological supremacy, had failed catastrophically. Mechanical breakdowns continued to plague the survivors, with transmission failures and engine fires claiming more vehicles than enemy action. German engineers who had rushed these machines into combat before resolving their technical problems now watched helplessly as their advanced designs became monuments to overconfidence and poor planning. Soviet losses were equally staggering, but their significance differed fundamentally from German casualties. The 5th Guards Tank Army had lost hundreds of T-34 tanks and thousands of experienced crew members, yet Soviet factories were already producing replacements at a rate that dwarfed German manufacturing capacity. More importantly, the Red Army had achieved its strategic objective. Operation Citadel was broken, its momentum shattered against the anvil of Soviet determination. When the guns finally fell silent at Kursk, the smoking ruins of 6,000 tanks bore witness to a turning point that would reshape the course of history. Operation Citadel, Hitler's last great gamble for victory in the East, lay shattered across the Russian steppes alongside the dreams of German conquest. The Wehrmacht would never again possess the strength to launch a major offensive, while the Red Army, tempered in the fires of this colossal battle, would roll inexorably westward toward Berlin. In 8 days of unprecedented carnage, the fate of nations had been decided not by grand strategy or political maneuvering, but by the courage of ordinary men who fought with extraordinary determination in the world's greatest clash of armor.